or whatever. And it's really more informal. I mean, it's not going to be, anything formal because, I mean, we're all brothers here, just, we're going to be kicking it. And, hey, you!
Okay, brother, you are.
All right, guy, get up against the wall. Let me see some ID, guy. They kill me with that. Yeah.
Go ahead, Mama.
Oh, it's on?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
Greetings.
All right, good evening, greetings. We're coming to you live from Urrus, or Buffalo, New York, and from the Moorish American Society of Comprehensive Science, also known as the Moorish Society of Atmaurium, of the Talismanic Kingdom of Atmaurium. Let's see. Again, as I said, we talked about a lot of things yesterday about the United States. I know that's one of the areas of interest that our sister Bert Lockett has concerning the beginnings of the United States Corporation in and throughout the continental United States, i.e. the Americas. And but in order to comprehend the myriad of actual events in and throughout the Americas and the Moorish Empire on a whole, or to have an accurate anecdotal account, we must look and explore the events of the planetary and galactical conditions involving Mars, Earth, and the days of Atlantis. Now, of course, a lot of people will ask, well, what does that have to do with the United States? It has a lot to do with it. When we look at the events and things which occurred in Atlantis some 16,000, 20,000 years ago, and even a million years ago, we can better comprehend and have an overall comprehension of exactly what occurred, or shall I say the cause and effect of ultimately what happened in the continental United States. So, we then consider early Atlantis, Kemet, axis, consciousness grid changes, Ascaic logometers, which is another way of saying Akashic records, lifelines of those Akashic records, Moorish talismanic thaumaturgy. Thaumaturgy is basically another term that's used for magic or ancient magic. We're also going to look at the science of ancestral incantations involving thaumaturgy, utilizing specific tones and language or languages of light. We're going to look at genealogy as well as true geography. Now I know that is a lot, but as I said, all of these things relate directly and indirectly to the history and the origins of the United States Corporation and why it was formed, etc. But as I said, going back to the time of Atlantis, when we look at about 20,000 years ago, there was a process that occurred that involved the Moors of Atlantis at that time. You also had Moors on Mars, and you also had Moors who were living underground at that time. These were masters, ascended masters from the sixth dimension, and I'll talk more about them in a minute. But the Moors that were actually living on Atlantis at that time, unfortunately, were involved in some experiments similar to that of the Philadelphia experiment in the 40s involving time travel. And unfortunately, they lost control of this experiment. And when things got out of control, ultimately it caused the cataclysmic event or destruction of Atlantis, the 10 islands of Atlantis. And in addition to which, it ripped a series of holes through a number of dimensions. And ultimately, that's what caused the problems that occurred in and throughout the Moorish Empire from that time up until the present. So as to questions about the decline of the Moorish Empire, you then again have to go back to these events, these experiments that they were conducting in Atlantis. And so when the time or the time machine experiment got out of control, as I said, it ripped holes in the dimension, and so consequently, it also caused an axis or planetary axis shift. And when the planetary axis shift occurred, it literally affected everything on the planet, including human memory or human memory retention, because human memory is largely dependent on magnetic fields. And the magnetic field of the Earth literally collapsed and was affected because of the planetary axis shift, and as I said, also because of this particular experiment that they were conducting. And so after this occurred, or after this time, you had many of the ascended masters from the sixth dimension who came back to Earth to assist the Moors that dispersed over various parts of the planet, of the globe, in Kemet, in the Americas, and many other places, Peru, etc. And so, in order to assist the Moors, what they did was that they started a process known as stair-step evolution, because the Moors at that time from Atlantis had literally gone back into a state of barbarism, or so-called barbarism. And they had lost a lot of the information, the sciences, etc., that they had once learned or mastered in Atlantis. And so, through a series of instructions, these ascended masters in what was known as the Tat Brotherhood, they would, through the stair-step evolutionary process, they would instruct these Moors in different areas of sciences in hopes that they would regain or recall much of what was lost. Unfortunately, such was not the case. It didn't really take. And so, unfortunately, thereafter you had a downward spiral that occurred. And thus, this is what brought in another experiment, but one of which was, or proved to be, a positive experiment in the creation of the ancient pharaoh known as Akhenaten, or some know him as Akhenaten. And anyway, Akhenaten was an immortal being who was created, and for the sole purpose of introducing what is known as Unamen's consciousness, or one mind or unity consciousness. And it was basically to bring the Moors to another level of consciousness. These Moors in particular, as I said, in Atlantis, who had lost a lot of their memory and the sciences. And so in attempting to introduce the Unamen's consciousness, they did this through establishing what later became known as the ancient mystery system of Kemet, which actually stemmed from the Nakal mystery school of Atlantis. And in these schools, they instructed many of the Moors in many of the high sciences, breathing techniques, as I said, language tones or tones of languages of light, so as to raise their consciousness, to bring them in harmony with the grids. As a matter of fact, just backtracking a little, when the magnetic field collapsed back in Atlantis, or during the time of Atlantis, ultimately what happened was that not only did it affect the human memory, but it also affected the grids. And so what these ascended masters had to do was that they had to actually plug into the grid consciousness of the planet, the logarithmic spiral grids of the planet in various parts or key positions of the Earth. in order to, again, assist these Moors in helping to raise their consciousness. And so when we look at these different techniques involving the languages, the tones of the languages, etc., in particular ancient languages that you'll find, like for example in the ancient Moabite, the Aramaic, many of the Kemetic languages, tones, etc. The one thing of which I find to be very interesting that most people don't touch on, even for those that deal with etymology, is that when you're talking about these particular ancient languages and these tones that help to respatialize the organism so as to raise the harmonic level of the body and consciousness on a whole, is that these languages are actually alkaline-based languages. Now I know we think of, alkaline in terms of, foods, different types of foods we eat, etc. But these particular languages were alkaline-based as opposed to the acidic dialects and languages that we use today. As for example, not so much the English language. So don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with the English language per se, because it was actually one of many languages that was created by the Moors. It's just that the modern Albion, so-called English European dialect that we've adopted is the problem. And this particular dialect is acidic and also electrical, as opposed to the alkaline-based languages of which I'm talking about, which are also highly magnetic. And so, again, when we look at these particular languages that I mentioned, they actually feed the melanin in addition to raising the consciousness, and they're high resonating. They're also carbon and silicon based, which are two of the most unique elements on the periodic table of elements. And so the carbon and silicon based languages that again feed the melanin, I should also include in that list Moorish Latin, or ancient Moorish Latin. Now, all of these ancient tonal patterns actually mimic the pattern of melanin. And as I said, as opposed to the acidic electrical dialect that we're using in the so-called English language. And which, by the way, when I say acids, I mean infectious or an infectious saturation of acids of the blood and bones. And this is symptomatic of what is known as cretinism. Now, many of you know that the definition of Christian is Cretan and Cretan is Christian. But now if we take it a step further, we look at cretinism, and cretinism is actually a form of myxedema. Myxedema is basically an underactive thyroid, or an underactive thyroid gland known as hypothyroidism, or Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which basically is a poor binding process of iodine to a group of amino acids of a glycoprotein made in the thyroid gland. And these amino acids are tyrosine residues in the thyroglobulin, or TGB, which are precursor hormones of thyroxine and triiodothyronine, T3 and T4. And this particular iodine deficiency also shows itself in blood disorders, which again, like I said, this is all a pattern of the acidic dialect of so-called English that we're using. And thus is the reason why the European is so insistent on us using this particular dialect that works for him, in his customs, in what he calls law, but is not law, but is actually a custom being imposed upon us. But it doesn't really work for us for the simple reason of what I had explained earlier about it not being a magnetic, alkaline-based language. And so, as I said, this is also indicative of being linguistically strung out on methadone hydrochloride. Now, what do I mean by that? When I say methadone hydrochloride, in terms of this acidic language, that I'm referring to, and the pore binding process of iodine. I'm basically talking about a form of mathematics. So when we talk about language, we have to consider mathematics, we have to consider the helixography, the DNA and RNA of language, or the genetics of language, and a whole host of other things. But, as I said, so when we're talking about mathematics, we're talking about methodology. And so math is meth. Okay, so as a matter of fact, which is the abbreviation or slang for, again, methadone. So we're talking about a corrupt form of mathematics that has been imposed or superimposed on our people. Now, I know this may sound kind of strange to some extent, because it's like, okay, you started out with Atlantis, and you said that it has some relation or correlation to the United States, and the United States Corporation, and it does. But all of these things have to be considered, as I said, in terms of cause and effect, to see exactly how this played into the dynamic of the Moorish Empire, the ebb and flow of the Moorish Empire from Anatolia to the Crimea, all the way back to the Americas, Latinum, known as Moorish Spain, and other parts of the Moorish Empire. In fact, not to get away from the methadone effect, is that, so we're talking about a corruption of language, and we're talking about a corruption of language, we're talking about something which is foreign and therefore barbaric, because barbaric or barbarian means foreign. And so when we understand it from that particular perspective, then we're looking at those who are on a day-to-day basis, meaning the Albion male, of whom again is imposing the acidic electrical or electrically charged dialect upon our people, are daily seeking convictions via their court system. And so when you look at the fact that they're constantly seeking convictions of our people, conviction is actually dealing with what? Language as well, because when you say something, you say it with conviction, as in the case of someone being convicted by a jury of their so-called peers. They're actually saying it with what? Conviction, and in addition of which is a form of damnation. So they're actually looking to convict you for eternal damnation in the Cretan system. And so this is what has played an integral part or integral role in, again, the dynamic of the Moorish Empire, particularly in and throughout the United States. So now, when we look at the beginnings of the Moorish corporate family trust, known as the United States, or more commonly known as the United States, it's important to understand that it was not originally known as the United States in 1774. That is what has become a common appellative. But if you do any research and you look at the Annales Continens, the Annales Continens is the Continental Records, which prior to that was known as the Annales Imperium, which was the Imperial Records. And now in the Imperial Records, you have what is known as the Consociuimus Regnum. The Consociuimus Regnum was a consolidation or a convocation of 13 royal families. Those royal families were Moorish families that basically consolidated their power for a number of reasons, of which I'll go into, in forming this corporate family trust, again, as I said, that we call the United States Corporation. And they did this under what was known as the Capitis Societas, known to you as the Articles of Association, and 3 years later the Capitis Civitatis, known as the Articles of Confederation. However, as you can see from the names that I'm giving, or the terminology that's being used, is that these documents were not originally in English. Many of them were in the ancient Moorish Latin language. Um, Again, as I said, if you do any extensive research, if you look in, there are particular sections in the Library of Congress as well as the Department of State Library, of which only very few people have access to, that will give you more information on the early years of the forming of the United States Corporation. At any rate, as I said, it was essentially or loosely termed Consociumos Regnum, which basically was an act. It was not a name per se that was used for the United States, because when you say Consociumos Regnum, Consociumos basically means that we have united, meaning that we have done something, or a group of us have done something, meaning we nobles or we membrana of this particular thing that we have formed, or these United Kingdoms. And so Consociumos Regnum was the consolidation or convocation of these 13 kingdoms. But what has happened with the whole United States aspect is that they've been using an indicative verbal action in the noun sense, or nonsense, if you will. Meaning that when they say the United States, obviously they're using a definite article, the, and so therefore using it in the noun sense. But when you say anything, even according to the rules of English, and you add an ed, like I walked to the store, obviously that indicates that you've done something as in a verbal action. And therefore cannot be used as a name or again in the noun sense. So these particular 13 kingdoms, later misnamed colonies and states, had rulers known as Beys, Beygs, or Beglabegs. These Bey titles were titles that were also used by the first ruler of China, known as Qinbai, and of course also used in the Moorish Ottoman Empire, more commonly known as the Ottoman Empire, the Bey or Bey title. But anyway, these Beys or Bey rulers on the continent in the 1760s and 70s were kings, princes, and governors owing allegiance to the Sultan at that time, Sayyid ibn Abdullah Muhammad XVII, who ruled between 1757 and 1790 from Marrakesh. Now Marrakesh at that time was Philadelphus or Philadelphia, which was both, this was a part of Mauritania or Mauritania, and Mauritania was actually in North and South Dakota, here in North America. And of course Marrakesh, as I said, was Philadelphia, and Marrakesh, which later became known as Morocco, means sons of Cush. And so this royal family, or convocation of royal families rather, the 13 royal families, some of the names, if you read in the imperial records or the continental records, as opposed to the congressional records, some of the names were Agenor, Agathocles, Ayak, Barca, which, by the way, Barca is another name or an ancient name for Chicago. And after Barca, it became known as Libya or Ludim. And the people, the Moorish people, were known as Lahabim at that time. But anyway, as I said, one of the names, Ayak, the English equivalent, believe it or not, would be Ajax. So what they've done is the Albion has reduced many of these royal names and titles to toilet cleansers and other derogatory things, which I find to be very interesting. Now, also the name Agathocles, which, as I said, was one of the names of the royal families, is where we get the Aga title for governor, which is, of course, also used in the Turkish language as well. But anyway, as I said, many of these legal documents were not in the lingua anglice, or the English language, until actually a century later. So again, you're looking at the time of the federal Christian European influence under bankruptcy reconstruction between 1861 and 1878, which was one of the reasons, apart from many reasons, of the Civil War, because it was to give them enough time to actually change or alter many of the salient records, to, as I said, to translate them, to omit things by, again, omission or commission. And so it gave them enough time to pray and alter these records, and to ultimately give you the popularized versions that you read today in your miseducation system. And so the original, of course, is always under lock and key, and you get the neutered version or neutered translation. But back to 1774, when the Corporate Family Trust was organized or created, one of the main reasons for the convocation or consolidation was due to the fact that the Moorish sway in the Americas was on the fast track of decline because of the 300 years continental wars between the Franciscan Dutch and the Mozarabs. The Mozarabs is basically another term, a name for Cretan or Christian Spaniards. Now during this time, during the 300 years continental wars, you had many of the older generations of Moors who were dying off. Many were prisoners of war. The newer generations were being born in war camps, and were now being nationally lobotomized via Cretan reclassification and socio-behavioral modification. And this is what Prophet Noble Ali is referring to in chapter 47, verses 16 and 17, when he tells us that through sin and disobedience every nation has suffered slavery due to the fact that they honored not the Cretan principles of their fathers or forefathers. And this is why the nationality of the Moors was taken away from them in 1774, and the words Negro, Black, and Colored were given to the Asiatics of America who were of Moorish descent. So anyway, but the loss of nationality, even though it's understood that the nationality of the Moors was taken away in 1774, it's important to understand that the nationality meant the majority of Moors and not all of the Moors, including, for example, the royals of the Continental, what later became the Continental Congress, and about 1,000 Moorish factions. But understanding the seriousness of the situation, these Moors of the royal convocation, was again the fundamental reason for, one, the formation of the Corporate Family Trust, the National Trust, in again what later became the United States, and two, the establishing of the federal political system for the Albion Male, as this was a part of the Moors' C3 Communications Operation Command Stratagem, or military strategy, that was used to, as strange as it may sound to some, it was to ensure the survival of future generations. You should also know that even though the Moors, or the Moorish Navy rather, more specifically, fell in West Palestine on the Sea of Galilee in 1795, the royal families nonetheless were still running government from behind the scenes until Civil War era reconstruction. So initially, the congressional membership consisted of the above 13 rulers and key family members that eventually comprised 35 members, and finally the 20 observers. Only the Bey kings, princes, and governors were eligible to serve as praisens, or president, commander-in-chief, of which there were between the years of 1774 and 89, 16 to be exact, who not only did they, like presidents of the modern era, sign congressional laws, treaties, military orders, but in addition presided over judicial congressional cases. And in 1775, under the Henry Middleton and Peyton Randolph second term administration, was the beginning of the so-called or infamous American Revolution. Now what's very interesting about this is because of how we've been, again, miseducated and taught history, etc., we tend to look at it compartmentally. In other words, we think of the American Revolution, okay, Crispus Attucks, that whole thing, and Boston, and Paul Revere, etc., and nothing else was going on. But as I mentioned earlier, you had a 300 years continental war that was going on in many parts of the continent. In parts of, Guaymi Cuna, known as Panama, Maco Tucana Huitoto, known as Colombia, Yonamam, Arawak Carib, Venezuela, Utuapaque Pima, Mexico, Maya, Guatemala, Araucanian, Chile, Diaguita, Bolivia, and Apibon, Paraguay. So, in 1775, this American Revolution took place principally in the northeast areas of Brutium, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Idumea, which are known. Brutium was actually also known as Pergamos, which if you read the so-called Christian Bible in Revelations, they talk about Pergamos, which is Brutium, Massachusetts. Another name for it was Comasacumcanit, which I'll talk about that in a minute concerning Hano Bay's legal document, the Born Stone, which is an ancient document, ancient Moorish document, that I also talk about